The lot smelled of exhaust and wet asphalt, the particular staleness of a Tuesday morning that hadn't decided yet whether it would rain. Daniel Reyes stood at the curb outside Fairview Elementary at 7:42, his hands stiff inside his jacket pockets, and did the math he already knew the answer to. $118.37. He didn't need to check the app. He'd checked it every morning for 4 months, the way some men check the weather before deciding what to wear. 11 days ago, his Corolla had died on the shoulder of Route 9, and since then he'd walked Mia the 14 blocks to school, her small hand inside his, both of them pretending the walk was a choice and not a consequence. He'd been a mechanic on the service floor at Hendrick Auto until March, when the whole floor was let go in a single afternoon. Now he fixed what people would pay him to fix, out of a garage that still smelled faintly of his wife's absence, 2 years gone this spring, and of 9-year-old Mia's certainty that her father could repair anything. The car waiting for him after drop-off was $100. A farmer 3 counties over wanted it gone before the scrapyard came for it. Rust eating through the wheel wells, engine seized solid, one headlight hanging by its wiring like something that had stopped looking forward. Daniel didn't drive out there because he believed in the car. He drove out there because it was the only thing within $100 of what he had left. Kneeling to check the undercarriage before he'd hand over the cash, he caught the edge of something under the dashboard. A small metal tag, hand-stamped, half buried under decades of grime. He didn't read it. He didn't have time to read it. He wiped his palms on his jeans and reached for the bill of sale the farmer was already holding out. Behind him, gravel shifted under tires that cost more than his last 4 years combined. A black SUV, waxed to a shine that caught the gray morning light, pulled in and stopped 6 feet from his open trunk. Daniel didn't turn around yet. He was still signing his name. Vanessa Kirkland stepped out of the Range Rover the way she did everything, as if a small audience had already gathered to watch her do it. Cream cashmere, buttoned to the throat against a cold she didn't actually feel. A Cartier watch that caught the light when she reached up to push her sunglasses into her hair. She was the unofficial mayor of the Fairview pickup line, married to a man who managed other people's money for a living, and had made sure, over the years, that everyone within earshot knew it. She looked at the coupe first, then at the thin gray smoke curling up from under its hood. Then she laughed. Not a loud laugh, nothing that would draw a teacher's attention, just loud enough to travel exactly as far as she wanted it to travel. "Sweetheart," she said to Daniel's back, "in this neighborhood that's not a car, that's a cry for help." Mia, buckling her seatbelt 6 feet away, went very still. Daniel didn't answer. He crouched by the open hood and checked the oil, the dipstick between 2 fingers, as though the words had passed through the air without finding him. Behind him, Vanessa's son was telling anyone who'd listened that his father had surprised him that morning with a car for his 16th birthday. $95,000, matte gray, already photographed for Instagram before the bow was off. The boy's voice and Daniel's silence filled the same 3 seconds of morning air, and neither of them noticed the other had happened. Vanessa didn't wait for a response. She rarely did. She got back into the Range Rover and pulled away, already dialing someone about lunch. Daniel drove the coupe home at 11 miles under the limit, listening to a sound in the engine he didn't like. That night, after Mia was asleep, he worked in the garage with a rag and a can of degreaser, wiping down the dashboard he intended to sell parts from within the month. The rag caught on something under the steering column, a small tag, hand-stamped into metal, cold and sharp-edged against his knuckle. He tilted it toward the shop light. A number. 3 letters beside it, half worn away. None of it meant anything to him. But he remembered distantly his old service manager at Hendrick saying something once about barn-find chassis tags, that a stamped number like this, if it matched the right ledger, could be worth more than the whole dealership put together. Daniel photographed the tag with his phone, sat down at the kitchen table, and typed the number into a search bar before he let himself think better of it. $40 in gas got him 3 counties and 11 miles past the edge of anywhere Daniel recognized, past towns that were really just a gas station and a church, until the GPS gave up and told him he'd arrived somewhere it couldn't picture. Mia had fallen asleep against the window an hour ago, her sneakers still on, a granola bar wrapper folded neatly in her lap because she was the kind of kid who folded things even in her sleep. He hadn't been able to afford a sitter. He'd told the Hutchins family he couldn't fix their water heater this Saturday, and that was $40 he wasn't making to spend $40 he didn't have, chasing a number stamped into a piece of scrap metal. The warehouse announced itself in diesel and mildew before it announced itself in shape. An old smell, settled deep into corrugated steel that had been baking and freezing for longer than Daniel had been alive. The sliding door gave a groan when he forced it, metal dragging against a rusted track, and the air that met him inside was 10 degrees colder than the parking lot, still and thick, the kind of cold that lived somewhere concrete never fully dried. Dust sat undisturbed over rows of engine blocks and workbenches, gray and even, like snow that had fallen indoors and simply stayed. No one answered when he called out. No one had answered the number he'd found online either. He stood there a long moment, calculating what this trip had already cost him against what it was likely to return, and nearly turned back. There was a real repair job sitting at home, real money he'd turned down for this. But leaving before he understood something was never a habit Daniel had let himself keep. He'd spent his whole life finishing what he started, whether or not anyone was there to see it finished. He walked the length of the warehouse floor. Beneath a faded stencil reading V, Racing Division, his boot came down on concrete that didn't sound like concrete. Hollow. Wrong. He knelt, knuckles against the floor, and from somewhere in the dark behind him, Mia's voice cut through the quiet. "Dad, I found something." Daniel took a crowbar from the truck bed and brought its flat end down against the spot where his boot had gone hollow. The sound came back wrong, a dull, metallic ring where solid concrete should have answered with nothing at all. Mia's flashlight found it a second later, sweeping low across the floor until it caught a thin, dark line cutting through the dust, in a shape too straight, too deliberate to be a crack. A hinge seam. Someone had built a door into this floor and spent decades making sure no one noticed. The tire iron went into the seam on the third try. Rust screamed against rust, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere lower than the floor itself, and Daniel's palms had split open before the hatch finally gave, swinging up on hinges that hadn't moved since before he was born. Cold air rose out of the dark beneath it, cooler than the warehouse, drier, carrying the smell of oiled paper and old leather, a smell that belonged to somewhere that had been sealed on purpose. He lowered himself down first. A room the size of a two-car garage, lined floor to ceiling with steel filing boxes, and at the center, resting on a wooden stand like something meant to be found rather than stumbled upon, a leather-bound ledger with a single word tooled into its cover. Voss. He read it kneeling, flashlight balanced on his shoulder, and he did not gasp, and he did not call out for Mia to come look. He went very still, the way a man goes still when his body understands something before his mind is finished catching up. The coupe rusting in his driveway wasn't a farm junker. It was Prototype 7, the last surviving chassis from Elias Voss's Works Team program, built in 1971 for a factory debut that never happened, because 3 weeks before the unveiling, the program's sponsor withdrew every dollar and walked away without explanation. 6 prototypes had existed. 5 were scrapped when the doors closed. 1 was sold for almost nothing to a buyer no one bothered to record, and disappeared from every account Voss had ever managed to write. Tucked into the ledger's final pages was a letter, the handwriting steady, unhurried, the handwriting of a man who had planned this moment for longer than Daniel had been driving. To whoever finds this and finishes what I couldn't. It named the sponsor not with anger, but with a kind of clinical contempt, a man who'd had the courage to fund a dream, and none of the courage to stand behind it when it got difficult. It instructed the finder, plainly, to contact one of 3 Mark Historian Societies before entertaining any claim of private ownership, because paperwork could be forged and men could lie, but the chassis itself could not. On the ledger's opposite page, stamped in Voss's own hand 53 years earlier, was the original factory chassis number. 6 digits and 2 letters, recorded nowhere else on Earth. The one thing about that car that no one would ever be able to fake. The letter ended in 4 lines. I built it to be driven by someone who wasn't looking for glory. I don't know your name. I don't need to. Apparently that took 50 years. Finish it for me. Daniel closed the ledger the way a man closes something he understands is no longer just paper. That was when the light swept across the broken windows above him. Headlights, cutting slow arcs through the dark, coming to a stop outside a warehouse no one was supposed to know they'd come to. 2 men crossed the gravel toward him with the unhurried confidence of people who had never once been told no and made it stick. The taller one wore a blazer that fit too well for a warehouse at 9 o'clock at night, and he introduced himself before Daniel had finished standing up. Grant Palick, Palick Heritage Acquisitions. He said it the way other men said their own names, like a credential rather than an introduction. Daniel already knew, without being told, exactly how they'd found him. 2 days earlier, he'd called a pawn shop that ran VIN lookups on the side, asking a mechanic's ordinary question about a chassis number under a dashboard tag. He hadn't thought about who else that shop talked to. He was thinking about it now. Palick's paperwork was clean, laminated, official-looking in the specific way that things look official when someone has spent money making sure they do. He explained, in the even, patient tone of a man reciting something rehearsed until it no longer felt like a lie to him, that Palick Heritage represented the dissolved estate of Voss Racing Division, and that a decades-old lien entitled the estate to reclaim any recovered chassis before private sale. He said the words probate deadline and reversion clause the way other men said the weather, and he gave Daniel 6 days, Friday, close of business, before the coupe would revert to the estate by default. No signature required, no court necessary. Daniel didn't argue. He'd learned a long time ago that the men most eager to be believed were rarely worth arguing with. Better to watch than to interrupt. So he watched Palick's hands instead of his mouth, and he read the paperwork twice instead of once, and on the second pass he found it. A 6-digit chassis number stamped across the top of every page, close enough to the one in Voss's ledger to fool a glance, wrong by exactly 1 transposed digit. A number that didn't match the tag under the dash. A number Palick had clearly never seen written correctly, because he had never seen the ledger at all. Palick didn't know that. He assumed the grimy tag under Daniel's dashboard was the only thing standing between a mechanic and a fortune he didn't understand. He rested one hand flat against the coupe's hood, proprietary, almost gentle, the way a man touches something he's already decided is his. Friday, he said. Sign it over, or it gets towed whether you agree or not. Daniel looked at the hood under Palick's hand. Then he looked at the ledger sitting in the cab of his truck, 40 feet away, exactly where Palick would never think to look. And he understood exactly what he had to do. Daniel made 3 phone calls before Friday, and none of them were to Palick. The first went to a Mark Historian Society in Ohio, exactly as Voss's letter had instructed, and the woman who answered went quiet in a way that told Daniel more than her words did once he read her the number stamped inside the ledger. The second and third calls he made on instinct rather than strategy, one to Palick himself, inviting him to finalize things properly at the garage Friday morning, and one to a name he'd heard exactly once, from Mia, repeating something a classmate's father did for a living. Ellis Kirkland, auction financier, Vanessa's husband. They all arrived within 11 minutes of each other. Palick came first, blazer pressed, a driver waiting in the car with the engine running like a man who expected this to take 5 minutes.
The historian came next, carrying a case that looked older than the ledger itself. Ellis Kirkland came last, curious rather than convinced, the way men in his profession usually were until the numbers told them otherwise. The historian didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She opened the ledger to the page Voss had stamped in his own hand 53 years earlier, set Palick's laminated paperwork beside it, and read both chassis numbers aloud.
evenly, twice, the way a person reads something they want a room to hear correctly the first time. 6 digits and 2 letters against 6 digits and 2 letters, 1 digit transposed. She explained, without any particular emotion, that a factory-stamped chassis number recorded in an original engineering ledger could not be forged, disputed, or reasonably challenged by any document that failed to match it, and that Palak's paperwork, by definition, had never been built from the real number at all. Palak's charm didn't collapse loudly. It curdled. A small, involuntary pause, a hand that reached for his own paperwork and found nothing useful to do with it. His driver, still leaning against the open car door, watched the whole thing with the particular stillness of a man recalculating whether he still had a job by Monday. Daniel stood exactly where he'd stood weeks earlier, checking oil in a cold parking lot while a woman in cashmere told him what his life was worth. He didn't say it to Palak. He said it to no one in particular, evenly, the way the historian had read the numbers, and it carried far enough across the driveway that Vanessa Kirkland, arms crossed on her own porch 2 houses down, heard every word of it. Turns out a cry for help was worth $5 million. I'll take that trade. Ellis Kirkland was already reaching for his phone, offering, before Palak had even reached his car, to introduce Daniel to a private buyer he trusted completely. Daniel thanked him. Then he turned, walked back into his garage, and closed the door behind him, where Mia was waiting with 2 glasses of lemonade and no idea what any of it had meant. The Historian Society's report reached the state licensing board 9 weeks later, and Palak Heritage Acquisitions lost its dealer license before the year was out, its name quietly removed from 3 separate auction registries that had once trusted it without question. Vanessa Kirkland never mentioned the parking lot again. She didn't need to be told to stop. She simply watched her own husband broker the sale of a $100 car to racing legend Marcus Alvarez for $5 million, and something in her arithmetic seemed to correct itself after that. Her son stopped bragging at pickup. Nobody asked him to. Daniel didn't sell everything. He kept enough of the proceeds modest and put the rest into a small restoration shop off Route 9, the kind of place with good lighting and clean floors, where forgotten prototypes came to be preserved instead of flipped. He named it Voss and Reyes Motor Works, half for an engineer who'd trusted a stranger he'd never meet, half for himself. The coupe itself never fully left him. Alvarez, when he heard the story in full, insisted it go on long-term loan to a motorsport museum 2 hours north, rather than disappear into a private collection, with a small brass plaque crediting both Elias Voss and Daniel Reyes. Daniel drove up on weekends sometimes, just to see it under proper light. Months later, he stood in the same school parking lot where it had all begun, engine off, morning sun instead of exhaust fumes settling over the asphalt. His truck was modest and paid for outright. Mia came running out the front doors the way she always did, backpack half-zipped, and Daniel opened the passenger door the way he had 100 times before, except this time there was nothing left to calculate. No number in his head, no account balance he already knew by heart. Nobody in that parking lot ever apologized to him. He didn't need them to. The car had already told the truth for him.